Have you ever met someone so blindingly entitled that a piece of metal the size of a smartphone somehow ruins their entire life? Meet Susan. Susan is the HOA president of my neighborhood in Sedona, Arizona. 2 months ago, she marched up my perfectly swept driveway, pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my newly installed, totally normal 6-inch brass house numbers, and told me they were disrupting her spiritual connection to the mountains because of a slight morning glare. She hit me with a $500 fine and a mandate to replace them with something natural. So I did what any reasonable, legally savvy homeowner would do. I found a loophole in the HOA bylaws, called a heavy machinery contractor, and dropped a 5-ton, 10-foot-wide chunk of solid granite right in my front yard. Oh, and I hired a master stonemason to carve my house numbers 3 feet deep into the rock face. Susan called the cops. Susan called the city. Susan tried to wage war. But here's the beautiful part about local zoning laws and municipal erosion control permits. City law always crushes HOA feelings. To really understand the magnitude of this ridiculousness, you have to understand the setting. Sedona is gorgeous. I'm talking breathtaking red rock canyons that look like they were painted by a deity who was having a really good day. People come here to hike, to meditate, to find their center, and to buy overpriced crystals. But where there is premium real estate, there is an HOA. And where there is an HOA, there is a Susan. I had just closed on this beautiful corner lot house. It was a dream come true. Stucco walls, a flat roof to blend in with the desert, and a front yard filled with drought-resistant agave plants. The only thing missing was the house numbers. The previous owner had painted them on the curb, but the desert sun had bleached them into a faint, illegible chalk smudge. I figured I'd be a good neighbor. I wanted the delivery drivers to find me, and more importantly, if the house ever caught fire, I wanted the fire trucks to know which blazing inferno was mine. So, I took a little trip to the local hardware store. I walked down aisle 14, past the decorative mailboxes, and stood before the grand selection of house numbers. They had black iron, they had brushed nickel, and they had polished brass. I chose the brass, 6 inches tall, solid, classic. A little bit of shine to contrast the matte beige of the stucco. They cost me maybe $30. I drove home, grabbed my drill, measured twice, leveled them perfectly, and anchored them right next to my front door. I stepped back, wiped a drop of sweat from my forehead, and admired my handiwork. It looked great. It was a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, the peace of my desert oasis was shattered. I was standing in my kitchen at 7:15 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was waiting for my pour-over coffee to finish dripping. It was that golden hour when the sun just peeks over the red rocks and floods the valley with this incredible warm light. I took my mug, walked out to my front porch to breathe in the crisp morning air, and that's when I saw her. Susan didn't just walk up my driveway. She vibrated. She moved with the kinetic energy of 1,000 unwritten citations. She was wearing a silk bathrobe that probably cost more than my first car, fuzzy slippers, and she was clutching a clipboard like it was the Holy Grail. Her face was pinched in a way that suggested she had just smelled something rotting. "Excuse me," she barked, not even offering a good morning or a welcome to the neighborhood. "Are you the new owner?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. "I am, Dave. Nice to meet you." "Susan, board president of the Crimson Vista Homeowners Association," she announced, stating her title with the kind of gravity usually reserved for heads of state. She didn't extend a hand. Instead, she used the clipboard to point directly at my beautiful 6-inch brass house numbers. Those. They need to come down, immediately. I blinked. I looked at the numbers. I looked back at Susan. The house numbers? Why? They are an unauthorized, non-harmonious architectural accent, she declared, reciting the phrase as if she had practiced it in the mirror. And more importantly, they are creating a visual hazard. A hazard? Susan, they're numbers. They tell the mailman where to put the bills. They are highly reflective, she snapped, her voice rising an octave. Every morning, between 7:15 and 7:18, the sun crests over Cathedral Rock, hits those garish brass figures, and reflects a concentrated beam of light directly through my front bay window and onto my breakfast nook. It is entirely disrupting my morning meditation and my spiritual connection to the mountains. I stared at her. I literally could not compute what I was hearing. You want me to take down my house numbers because they reflect light into your house for exactly 3 minutes a day? I don't want you to do it, David, she said, narrowing her eyes. The HOA mandates it. You are in violation of Section 4, Paragraph B, regarding natural and harmonious exterior accents. They must be removed by tomorrow, or you will be fined. Before I could even formulate a response to this absolute lunacy, she spun around, her silk robe swishing dramatically, and marched back down my driveway. I watched her cross the street to her massive house, where, sure enough, a giant bay window faced my front door. I thought she was bluffing. I honestly did. I figured it was just an introductory flex, a way for the neighborhood tyrant to mark her territory. I went back inside, finished my coffee, and went about my week. The brass numbers stayed exactly where they were. 2 days later, the mail carrier handed me a certified letter. I had to sign for it. I tore open the crisp, heavy stock envelope. Inside was a formal notice from the Crimson Vista HOA. It was a citation for failure to rectify non-harmonious architectural accents. The fine? $500, payable within 30 days, and a warning that a recurring fine of $50 a day would be added until the offensive materials were removed. I sat at my kitchen island and laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who realized he had just stepped onto a battlefield he didn't even know existed. I had 2 choices here. I could pay the fine, take down the numbers, put up some dull, invisible wooden blocks, and let Susan dictate the rest of my life. Or I could read the rules. I chose the rules. I went to the bottom of a moving box and dug out the massive 3-ring binder that contained the HOA covenants, conditions and restrictions, the CC and Rs, the sacred text of Crimson Vista. I made a fresh pot of coffee, grabbed a highlighter, and sat down at the kitchen table. I read that document from cover to cover. I read about paint colors, only 6 approved shades of beige and terracotta. I read about garbage cans, must be concealed behind a wall no less than 4 feet high. I read about lawn ornaments, strictly forbidden, including gnomes, flamingos, and decorative frogs. And then, on page 47, buried under a section about driveway paving materials, I found it. The holy grail of malicious compliance, the section on residential identification. I read the paragraph once. I read it twice. A slow, wicked smile began to spread across my face. The exact phrasing was as follows. To maintain the rustic and natural aesthetic of the Crimson Vista community, all residential house identifiers must be constructed of materials that blend with the surrounding desert environment. Identifiers must be affixed to the primary dwelling or a natural landscaping element located within the front property boundary. to comply with municipal emergency services requirements, numbers must be a minimum of 4 inches in height. Did you catch that? Let me break it down. First, affixed to the primary dwelling or a natural landscaping element. That meant I didn't have to put them on the house at all. Second, and most importantly, minimum of 4 inches in height. Minimum. There was absolutely no mention of a maximum height. There was no mention of a maximum width. There was no restriction on the size of the natural landscaping element. Susan wanted natural? Oh, I was going to give her natural. I was going to give her so much nature she would choke on it. I grabbed my keys, walked outside, and took a screwdriver to the shiny brass numbers. I unscrewed them, packed them into a Ziploc bag, and tossed them into a kitchen drawer. I took a picture of the blank wall and emailed it to the HOA board with a polite note stating that the non-harmonious numbers had been removed and I was currently sourcing a natural alternative in strict compliance with the bylaws. Then, I drove out to the industrial side of town, away from the crystal shops and the vegan cafes, out where the dust was thick and the trucks were loud. I pulled into a massive commercial quarry and landscaping supply yard. The place was a dusty expanse of gravel, dirt mounds, and stones the size of minivans. I walked into the little tin-roofed office and was greeted by a guy who looked like he ate rocks for breakfast. He had a beard that could hide a badger, hands like catcher's mitts, and a name tag that just said Mike. "What can I do for you, boss?" Mike asked, wiping grease off his hands with a rag. "I need a rock, Mike," I said, leaning on the counter. "A big one." Mike chuckled. "You're at a quarry, buddy. We got rocks. How big we talking? You want some decorative garden stones? Maybe some river rock for a drainage ditch? Building a retaining wall?" "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I'm talking blocks a 2019 Range Rover's view of Cathedral Rock big. I'm talking needs a heavy-duty crane and a prayer to move big." Mike stopped wiping his hands. He raised an eyebrow, a slow grin forming. He recognized the look in my eye. It was the look of a man on a mission of pure, unadulterated spite. "Follow me." We walked out into the blazing sun, past the piles of gravel, all the way to the back of the lot. There, sitting by itself like a dormant beast, was a massive slab of raw, red and gray granite. It was roughly 10 feet wide, 5 feet tall, and jagged in all the right places. It looked ancient. It looked heavy. It looked absolutely perfect. "We call her the Widowmaker," Mike said, patting the side of the stone. "Weighed in at just over 10,000 pounds, 5 tons of solid earth. She's beautiful, ain't she?" "She's perfect," I said, visualizing the sheer panic on Susan's face when this thing dropped into her eyeline. "How much and how soon can you get it to my front yard?" "Well," Mike said, scratching his beard, "the rock is $2,000. The delivery is going to cost you another $1,500 because I have to bring out the industrial flatbed and the heavy hydraulic crane, and I can have it there Tuesday morning. But," he paused, giving me a serious look. "A rock this size, dropping it near a property line or a municipal street, you're gonna need a permit from the city, brother. You can't just drop 5 tons of granite in a residential neighborhood without the engineering department signing off. If it shifts, it could crack the water mains or tear up the asphalt." That stopped my momentum for a second. A permit. The city. That meant bureaucracy, which meant delays, which meant Susan might have time to find out and file an injunction. But then I remembered something. I thanked Mike, told him to put a hold on the Widowmaker, and drove straight down to the Sedona City Planning Office. I took a ticket, waited 45 minutes in a room that smelled like old carpet and municipal despair, and finally sat down across from a clerk named Brenda. "How can I help you?" Brenda asked, not looking up from her monitor. "I need to place a 5-ton granite boulder in my front yard," I said cheerfully. "I was told I need a permit." Brenda sighed, pulled a form from a stack, and slid it toward me. "Structural landscaping additions over 2,000 pounds require an engineering review. It's a 3-week process, and the fee is $200. 3 weeks. That was too long. "Is there any other way?" I asked. "Any other classification for a rock?" Brenda looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Are you building a retaining wall?" "No." "Are you modifying a natural waterway?" "No." "Does your property sit on a grade that experiences heavy runoff during the monsoon season?" I paused. My house was on a corner lot, and the driveway did slope downward toward the street. During the summer monsoons, water absolutely poured down that slope, washing a thin layer of red dirt onto the sidewalk. "Actually," I said slowly. Yes, it does." Brenda clicked her mouse a few times. "Then you don't want a structural landscaping permit. You want an erosion control and runoff mitigation permit under City Ordinance Section 5.4. The city heavily encourages residents to install natural erosion barriers to protect the municipal storm drains from sediment blockages." I leaned in, my heart beating a little faster. "And what does an erosion control permit entail?" "If you are placing a natural stone barrier to mitigate water flow, it's considered an essential property defense," Brenda explained in a monotone voice. "It's a fast-track permit. Costs $50. I can issue it right now as long as you promise to place it strategically to intercept the runoff." "Brenda, I promise you, this rock will intercept everything." She printed out the permit, stamped it with a heavy, satisfying thud, and handed it to me. "Have a nice day, sir." I walked out of that office holding a piece of paper that felt heavier than the boulder itself. Because here is the glorious, undeniable legal truth about Arizona state law and municipal ordinances. City and state laws regarding water conservation, erosion control, and environmental mitigation entirely supersede homeowners association bylaws. An HOA cannot legally force a homeowner to remove a city-mandated or city-permitted erosion control structure. It's federal and state public policy to prevent flooding. I had the ultimate shield. I called Mike from the parking lot. "Mike, we are clear for Tuesday. Bring the Widowmaker." Then I made one more phone call. I looked up the best custom stonemasons in the county. I found a guy named Hector who specialized in carving commercial signs into natural stone facades. I sent him the dimensions of the boulder, told him I needed my address carved into the face of it, and asked for his rush rate. "How big do you want the numbers?" Hector asked over the phone. I smiled. "Minimum of 4 inches, I said, quoting the bylaws. "But let's go with 3 feet tall. Each number, and carve them deep." Tuesday morning arrived. It was 6:30 a.m. The sun was just starting to peek over Cathedral Rock, sending that golden light spilling into the valley. I was standing on my front porch, holding a mug of coffee, feeling the cool morning air. Then I felt the vibration. Before I heard it, I felt it in the soles of my shoes. A low, rhythmic rumble. Then came the sound. The groaning, heavy diesel roar of an oversized commercial flatbed truck, followed closely by a massive yellow hydraulic crane truck. They turned the corner onto my quiet, pristine residential street, their air brakes hissing like angry dragons. The reverse beeping of the truck echoed through the canyon like the trumpets of the apocalypse. They parked right on the edge of my property line. Mike jumped out of the cab, wearing a hard hat and a high-vis vest. He waved at me. "Morning, boss. Where do you want her?" I walked out, carrying my stamped city permit just in case, and pointed to a very specific patch of dirt. It was exactly 3 inches inside my property line. It was perfectly positioned at the top of the slight slope of my yard to act as an erosion barrier. And entirely coincidentally, it sat dead center in the direct line of sight between Susan's bay window and the beautiful, majestic cathedral rock. "Right there, Mike. Drop it right there." The crew got to work. They extended the massive steel outriggers of the crane, planting them firmly onto the asphalt. The hydraulic engine roared to life, deafening in the quiet morning. They strapped heavy-duty nylon webbing around the Widowmaker. Slowly, agonizingly, the crane hoisted 5 tons of raw, jagged granite into the air. It was a magnificent sight. A giant rock floating over a perfectly manicured lawn. And right on cue, the front door of the house across the street flew open. Susan came sprinting out. She was wearing a different silk bathrobe this time, emerald green. But she still had the clipboard. She was waving her arms frantically, running across the street in her slippers, entirely ignoring the danger zone of the crane. "Stop! Stop this immediately!" she shrieked, her voice somehow cutting through the roar of the diesel engine. "What is the meaning of this? This is an unauthorized geological installation." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I leaned against my stucco wall. "Morning, Susan. Just complying with your mandate. You said the brass was non-harmonious. Getting in touch with nature, just like you wanted." "You cannot put a boulder the size of a van in your front yard," she screamed, pointing at the Widowmaker as it slowly rotated in the air. "It is an eyesore. It is destroying the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I demand you tell them to put it back on the truck." "Can't do that, Susan," I said calmly. "It's a permitted erosion control structure. City Ordinance 5.4. Got the paperwork right here." I tapped the front pocket of my shirt. "Erosion control?" she gasped, her face turning a vibrant shade of magenta. "You don't have erosion. You have a lawn." "The city disagrees," I smiled. The crane operator gave a shout, and with a heavy, ground-shaking thud, the Widowmaker touched down. The impact sent a cloud of red Arizona dust billowing into the air, lightly coating Susan's emerald bathrobe. The ground literally shook beneath our feet. The chains rattled as they released the tension. It was done. The unmovable object had been placed. Susan stood there, coughing in the dust cloud, staring up at the sheer wall of granite that now entirely blocked her panoramic view of the valley. "I am calling the police," she hissed, her eyes wide with fury. "I am calling the police, the city planner, and the HOA attorneys. You are going to jail for illegal dumping." "You do that, Susan," I said. "But you might want to wait a few hours. The second act hasn't even started yet." She stormed off, pulling out her cell phone before she even reached her curb. 10 minutes later, Hector the stonemason pulled up in a beat-up white van. He stepped out, took one look at the massive rock, took one look at the furious woman pacing in her front window across the street, and started laughing. "You're a crazy man, bro," Hector said, pulling out a heavy-duty angle grinder and a massive diamond-tipped saw blade. "Just need my house numbers, Hector, like we discussed." Hector put on his respirator mask, fired up a generator, and went to work. If the crane was loud, the saw was deafening. A high-pitched, screaming whine filled the neighborhood as Hector began cutting deep grooves into the granite face. Plumes of white rock dust shot into the air like a geyser. For 3 solid hours, Hector carved. He didn't just scratch the surface. He dug a foot deep into that rock, creating massive, blocky numbers. My address. 3 feet tall, a foot wide, and dominating the entire face of the boulder facing the street. By 10 a.m., he shut down the saw. He used a high-pressure hose to wash the dust away. The water ran down the rock, turning the granite a deep, rich red, and highlighting the massive shadowed numbers carved into its core. It was undeniable. It was permanent. It was a masterpiece of malicious compliance. At 10:15 a.m., the flashing red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. Susan had actually done it. She had called 911. A Sedona Police Department SUV rolled slowly to a stop in front of my house. Officer Jenkins stepped out. He was a veteran cop, probably just a few years from retirement, and he had the deeply tired eyes of a man who spent 80% of his shift dealing with rich people arguing over property lines. He took his time, putting on his hat. He looked at the 5-ton rock. He looked at the massive, freshly carved numbers still dripping with water. He looked across the street where Susan was practically bouncing up and down on her porch, waiting for him to draw his weapon and arrest me. Officer Jenkins walked up my driveway. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. "Morning, officer," I said. "Sir," Jenkins sighed. "Dispatch got a frantic call about illegal dumping, malicious property destruction, and a hazardous waste spill." "Hazardous waste?" I laughed. "It's a rock, officer, and it's my house number. The HOA president told me my old numbers were too shiny, said I needed a natural landscaping element. So I bought a rock." Officer Jenkins rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at the rock again. "Sir, that rock is bigger than my patrol car." "It's a minimum of 4 inches, I quoted smoothly. "The bylaws don't specify a maximum, and before she tries to say it's unpermitted..." I pulled the stamped paper from my pocket and handed it to him. "City of Sedona. Erosion Control and Runoff Mitigation Permit. Section 5.4. Fully authorized by the Engineering Department." Jenkins took the paper. He read it. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He handed it back. "Well, the paperwork is in order. It's on your property line. It's not blocking the roadway." He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, show me clear at the Crimson Vista address. It's a civil dispute over landscaping. No crime committed." He turned back to me. "Honestly, buddy, I can read that address from a mile away. The fire department is gonna love you. Have a good one." Officer Jenkins got back in his SUV and drove away without even speaking to Susan. The look on her face as the police cruiser rolled past her house was something I will cherish for the rest of my life. It was a mixture of absolute disbelief, burning rage, and the sudden, horrifying realization that she had picked a fight with someone who possessed a dangerous level of free time and a high tolerance for spite. So honestly, after Officer Jenkins drove away, the silence on the street was just absolute magic. It was the kind of deep, peaceful quiet that only comes right after a chaotic, screaming meltdown. I literally just stood on my porch for another 20 minutes, sipping the last of my cold coffee, watching Susan pace back and forth in front of her bay window like a trapped zoo animal. She kept picking up her phone, yelling into it, and slamming it down. I guess the city planner and the HOA attorneys were not giving her the instant gratification she was demanding. I went inside, took a shower, and went about my day, knowing a storm was brewing, but feeling completely, utterly bulletproof. I didn't have to wait long. At exactly 4 p.m. that same day, a teenager on a bicycle aggressively pedaled up my driveway and practically threw a manila envelope at my front door before peeling out. I picked it up. It was an official, expedited summons from the Crimson Vista Homeowners Association. It demanded my presence at an emergency disciplinary tribunal scheduled for the very next evening at the community clubhouse. The charge? Willful, spiteful, and catastrophic alteration of the community aesthetic. The proposed penalty, a $10,000 fine, and an immediate injunction to force the removal of the unauthorized geological hazard. 10 grand. I mean, they were really swinging for the fences now. But here's the thing about malicious compliance. If you are going to lay a trap, you don't just build the walls, you lock the door, throw away the key, and weld the hinges shut. I had the city permit for erosion control. That was a solid defense. But I needed an offensive weapon. I needed something that would make the HOA board mathematically terrified to even touch my rock. So I picked up the phone and called the Sedona Fire Department non-emergency line. I explained my situation to the dispatcher. I didn't mention the HOA drama. I just told them I was a new resident who had just installed custom, natural stone house numbers, and I wanted to request a courtesy inspection from the fire marshal to ensure my property was fully compliant with emergency visibility codes. Honestly, fire departments love proactive citizens. The very next morning, a bright red fire chief SUV pulled into my driveway. Captain Miller stepped out. He was a big, jolly-looking guy with a thick mustache. He walked up to the widowmaker, put his hands on his hips, and let out a long, low whistle. "Well now," Captain Miller chuckled, adjusting his uniform. "That is a rock." "Morning, Captain," I said, walking out to meet him. "Just wanted to make sure the address is visible from the street." He looked at the 3-foot-tall, deeply carved numbers, then looked down the street, then back at the rock. "Son, I could read those numbers from a low-orbit satellite. In 30 years on the job, I have never seen a house so clearly marked. Usually we're out here at 3 a.m. with flashlights trying to find a painted curb hidden under a parked car while someone is having a heart attack. This is magnificent." "So it passes code?" I asked, grinning. "Passes? It sets a new standard," he laughed. "Captain, could I bother you to put that in writing? Just a brief letter on official letterhead stating that my residential identification exceeds safety standards and provides critical visibility for emergency services. My insurance company loves that kind of stuff." "I'll have my secretary email you a signed PDF by noon," he promised, giving the widowmaker one last appreciative pat. "Keep up the good work." By the time Wednesday evening rolled around, I was practically buzzing with excitement. I put on a nice, crisp, button-down shirt, grabbed my black leather binder, and drove down to the community clubhouse. When I walked into the main hall, the tension was so thick you could carve it with a chainsaw. The room was packed. Word had clearly gotten around the neighborhood about the lunatic on the corner lot, who dropped a mountain in his yard. Neighbors were whispering, pointing, and staring as I walked down the center aisle. At the front of the room, sitting behind a folding table like a panel of Supreme Court justices, was the HOA board. And sitting dead center, radiating pure, unadulterated hostility, was Susan. She wasn't wearing a bathrobe tonight. She was wearing a sharp, tailored business suit, her hair sprayed into a rigid helmet of authority. Next to her was a guy in a cheap gray suit who looked incredibly bored. I immediately clocked him as the HOA's retained legal counsel. "Order! I call this emergency tribunal to order," Susan announced, banging a little wooden gavel she had actually brought from home. I am not kidding. She had a personal gavel. "We are here to address the egregious, malicious, and frankly unhinged behavior of the resident at Lot 42, David." I took a seat in the front row, crossed my legs, and smiled at her. David has intentionally bypassed architectural review to install a massive, hideous boulder that completely destroys the sightlines of the neighborhood, Susan continued, her voice shaking with righteous indignation. "He has claimed it is an erosion barrier, which is a blatant manipulation of city ordinances. We are here to vote on a maximum penalty of $10,000 and to authorize the HOA to hire a private contractor to remove the obstruction at the owner's expense." She glared down at me. "Do you have anything to say in your defense before we vote and place a lien on your property?" I stood up slowly. I walked over to the podium facing the board. I opened my binder. I took a deep breath, and I let the trap spring closed. "Thank you, Susan, and members of the board," I started, keeping my voice calm, professional, and dripping with polite venom. "I would like to address this situation chronologically. First, regarding the accusation of bypassing architectural review. As per the citation I received last week, Susan explicitly instructed me to remove my brass house numbers because they were, quote, non-harmonious. I was directed to replace them with a natural alternative. So I turned to the C, C, and RS. I pulled out a highlighted copy of the bylaws and slid it across the table to the board lawyer. "Page 47, section on residential identification," I read aloud for the crowd. "Identifiers must be affixed to the primary dwelling or a natural landscaping element. I chose a natural landscaping element. Granite, the Earth's crust. It doesn't get more natural than that. Furthermore, the rule states numbers must be a minimum of 4 inches in height. There is no maximum height listed in this entire document. There is no maximum size listed for the natural landscaping element. I followed the letter of the law exactly as written." Susan slammed her hand on the table. "That is an absurd interpretation of the rules, and you know it. You did this out of spite." "Intent is irrelevant, Susan. Compliance is what matters," I replied smoothly, not breaking eye contact. "Now, regarding the installation itself, you threatened to have the HOA hire a contractor to remove it. I would strongly advise against that." I pulled out the city permit with the heavy blue municipal stamp. I handed it directly to the lawyer. "This is an official City of Sedona erosion control and runoff mitigation permit, issued under Municipal Ordinance 5.4, I explained, projecting my voice so the people in the back row could hear. "My property slopes toward the street. The city engineer has officially designated my natural granite installation as critical infrastructure to protect the municipal storm drains from sediment blockages." I leaned over the podium, locking eyes with the lawyer, who suddenly didn't look bored anymore. He was reading the permit intensely. "Counselor," I said to him, "I'm sure you are aware of Arizona state law regarding municipal environmental infrastructure. If the Crimson Vista Homeowners Association forcibly removes, alters, or damages a city-mandated or permitted erosion control structure, the HOA, not me, assumes total, absolute legal and financial liability for any subsequent water damage, flooding, or sediment blockage that occurs on that municipal roadway." A collective gasp went up from the back of the room. The treasurer, a nervous-looking guy at the end of the table, suddenly went very pale. "I have drafted a liability waiver," I said, pulling out a perfectly formatted legal document. "If the board votes to remove my rock tonight, I just need Susan and every other board member to sign this document stating that you personally accept liability for all future municipal fines and street repair costs caused by monsoon runoff." "We will not sign that!" Susan shrieked, standing up. "This is blackmail." "It's not blackmail, Susan. It's municipal engineering," I smiled. "But wait, there's one more thing." I reached into the back pocket of my binder and pulled out the piece de resistance, the beautiful, crisp letterhead from the Sedona Fire Department. I slid it across the table to the lawyer, placing it right on top of the city permit. "This morning, the Sedona Fire Marshal conducted an inspection of my property," I said, my voice ringing clear in the silent room. He issued this formal declaration stating that my newly installed residential identification provides, quote, critical and unprecedented visibility for emergency services, vastly exceeding local safety codes. I looked back at Susan, whose mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. So, I concluded, wrapping up my presentation, if you force me to remove the rock, you are legally accepting liability for flooding a city street. And if you force me to alter or remove the carved house numbers, you are putting the HOA in direct violation of a fire marshal's safety endorsement, effectively making the board liable if emergency services fail to locate my house during a fire or medical emergency. Both of these actions would pierce your liability insurance coverage, meaning the city and my insurance company could sue you personally. I closed my binder with a sharp, echoing snap. So, Susan, does the board want to vote on my $10,000 fine, or do we want to adjourn? The room was dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. All eyes shifted to the lawyer. The lawyer slowly took off his reading glasses. He looked at the bylaws. He looked at the city permit. He looked at the fire marshal's letter. And then he looked at Susan. He leaned in and whispered something into her ear. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I saw her face drain of all its color. Her jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth were going to shatter. She shook her head. He whispered again, more forcefully this time, tapping his finger on the liability waiver. Susan stared at me. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was the look of a tyrant who had just realized her castle was built on sand, and I had just backed a dump truck full of granite right over it. She picked up her little wooden gavel. Her hand was shaking. Due to pending legal review of municipal overlapping jurisdictions, she choked out, every word sounding like it physically pained her. The board is dropping the citations against Lot 42. This meeting is adjourned. She slammed the gavel down, grabbed her purse, and power-walked out the side door without looking at anyone. The room erupted into murmurs, and honestly, a few people in the back actually started clapping. The treasurer looked like he was about to pass out from relief. I just smiled, picked up my binder, and walked out the front doors into the cool, desert night air. It's been about 6 months since the tribunal. The HOA hasn't bothered me once. Not about my trash cans, not about my paint, not about a single weed in my gravel. I am effectively a ghost in the system, completely untouchable. Every morning, I make my pour-over coffee. I walk out onto my front porch, and I look out at the beautiful Sedona landscape. And standing there, magnificent and unyielding, is the Widowmaker. The sun hits the red granite, illuminating my massive 3-foot-tall house numbers for the entire world to see. And directly across the street, Susan's bay window blinds remain permanently, aggressively drawn shut. She refuses to look out her front window because she knows that if she does, she won't see the mountains. She'll just see the massive, literal monument to her own pettiness, permanently cemented into the earth. The brass numbers are still safely tucked away in my kitchen drawer, gathering dust. But the granite? The granite is forever. When they try to use the rules to break you, use the law to break their view.